Hi, everybody. Welcome to Your Health, Your Way. I'm Lisa, and today I have the pleasure of having with me Dr. Vera Tarman. She is a world-renowned food addiction expert who writes, speaks, and treats people who suffer from food addiction, sugar addiction, and those who want to recover from those issues. In numerous workshops, she's spoken as a guest and has been co-host of 2 television addiction call-in shows, Addictions Unplugged and Toronto Speaks Addiction. She has been interviewed by national media, and she has been on multiple American and Canadian podcasts. Her website is addictionsunplugged.com, and Dr. Tarman is medical director of Renaissance, which is one of Canada's largest treatment centers for substance abuse. She's treated over 10,000 patients there. And Dr. Tarman is the author of Food Junkies, The Truth About Food Addiction, and Food Junkies, Recovery from Food Addiction. Dr. Tarman knows that freedom from food addiction is food serenity. Thank you so much, Dr. Tarman, for joining me today on Your Health, Your Way. And I know you are a wealth of information, and I want to be sure I didn't omit anything in that bio. Is there anything else that I missed out about your credentials?
No, thank you very much. I think you got it all. And I just want to add that I'm very pleased to be speaking with you today and to a potentially Spanish population. I think it's just great. I'm delighted.
Oh, wonderful. I'm excited about that too. So let's begin. When we think about food addiction, I mean, not food addiction, when we think about addictions, we think about drugs and alcohol, gambling, pornography, but food, people go, was food really addictive? Could you address that question?
Okay, so this is where we come to the definition of what food is. So if we were talking about food as in real food, the food that's not processed but that we actually grow, we probably wouldn't be having the conversation about whether it's addictive or not, because our brain is wired to like that food but not be addicted to it. Our brain is wired to want to eat the food, and then when we're full to want to stop it. But when we talk about processed food, we're talking about an entirely different phenomena, and that's where addiction can fit in, because it's actually been processed into the processing of the food. So yes, we can become addicted to foods that are not real foods, that are processed foods, but real food, no, I don't think so. With the caveat that if a person has already been so damaged from our food and has become a food addict, then even normal food might be a problem. But for the most part, the answer is no.
So is there an issue with, some people being more susceptible than others to food addictions? Because
Yes.
Not everybody's food addicted or, addicted to certain substances.
Yes, that's true. That is the case. And there are some people that actually use a susceptibility scale to determine whether a person is more susceptible to food addiction. And it's the same scale that we use, but modified for food in the general addiction paradigm. And, just the fact of using the addiction paradigm opens up the whole a whole venue of new language and new concepts and new scales and new treatments. So I think it's a great idea to include the whole paradigm of addiction, if for no other reason than it gives us a whole other bag of tools. But in terms of diagnosis, yes, it appears to be that some people are more susceptible to food addiction, and even before they were introduced to the foods of today, which will make anybody ultimately a food addict. But you can be born being more susceptible in the same way that you're born to being more susceptible to alcohol addiction or another addiction. Some people, their very first few drinks and they're already having a problem drinking, and other people, it can take until their 50s of regular drinking before it really gets them. And I think the same thing happens with food. However, I do believe that we're becoming more susceptible the more children, our babies, our infants are being exposed to unnatural foods. It makes the whole population more susceptible. But, we call it a susceptibility scale. In the larger addiction paradigm, it's, we have something called the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is a measure of a continuum of mild addiction all the way to full onslaught addiction. And that's almost like a susceptibility scale, but in the larger addiction world.
I see. And so when we talk about the susceptibility scale, it could be, say, a person that scores low on it could have, maybe it's those people that can have a couple of cookies for dessert and put the rest away. versus those that score higher on the susceptibility scale,
Yeah.
they don't stop at 2. They have the whole bag, and then maybe they go for
Yeah.
more.
Well, I think it would be fair to say that anybody who has a couple of cookies will, if they, like them, which most people do, our brains are wired to like energy dense foods like sugar and fats together, and sugar, fats, and salts together even more. And so I think that a person who has 2 and maybe wants 5 is still really normal, because unless their responses are quite flattened, because the food, that's not normal food, and the food industry captures even normal people to overeat, but they might struggle and be able to stop at 5 or 6 or 7. But if you're moving along that susceptibility scale, that's the person who might have 2 or 3 rows of those cookies and feel bad about it, but they're still okay. And then we move to the next level, which is where they have the whole bag, and then they want even more. So I think just even people who want a couple and have 3 or 4, that's pretty normal. That's really just a response to our toxic food environment that makes us want to have more, even when we're normal eaters.
I see what you're saying. So that's kind of like what I read in a book recently, where it talks about how when you talk about the foods of today and the processing of foods, they refer to, for example, the poppy plant, where a person can consume poppy seeds.
Yeah.
Those are not addictive, but once it's refined into opium,
exactly,
that becomes addictive. And we know the issue with that in the United States right now.
Yeah, and somebody like that, they may take their Percocets or whatever it is that they've been prescribed and take them properly, and may have, I don't want to say a bit of a problem, but if they stop, they find that they will have some tolerance and they might feel a bit sick, and so they might take it for a bit longer. That doesn't mean they're addicts by any means. It's just a response to that designed, it's a designed, it's kind of the brain doing its job in this toxic environment. And for the most part, those are people who can stop after a tiny bit of a struggle. But it's when it causes havoc, that's what we're talking about.
Right. And then the food specifically that you mentioned in your book, what are the foods that you refer to as being addictive?
Well, okay, so pretty much anything that will give more than it's supposed to and faster than it's supposed to. So our brain needs oxygen and it needs glucose to survive. And so we have been wired in our neurochemistry to desire anything that's life-sustaining. And in terms of food, that it's going to like food or sugars, and it's going to like sugars in the continuum of fat. It's an energy-dense process. So basically any food stuff that has a lot of sugar in it is already designed to make me want it. And then if that food company wants me to have even more, it's going to try to make the medium of intake or absorption more efficient. In other words, get rid of the fiber and make it like coated in a lot of fat so that you can get down a lot more quickly. You're kind of putting in all the ingredients of what makes something addictive. So you say, what is addictive? I mean, I can give you specific things like chips and popcorn and pizza and chocolate, but what is common to all of those is it's heavy wallops of sugar that can go down fast.
Understandable. And then why is it so important these days to acknowledge food addiction?
Well, I want to, before I answer that, because that's a very important question, I just want to say that, let me just finish more on that other question. Or I realized that there was another piece I wanted to add, and that is that, so an example would be sugar, like in fruit, but take the fiber out of it so that it becomes like candy wraps or fruit wraps or fruit juice or wine, something that makes you have a lot of sugar quickly. But it can also be flour, because flour is already basically pre-digested complex carbs made into simple carbs. So that's why we can say that breads and cakes and muffins are addictive too. Anything that like the medium is more quick. I just wanted to add that piece. So
you take the sugar cane and you refine it into sugar, you take the grains and you refine it into flour, just
Yeah.
like you take the poppy plant, refine it into opium, the
Yeah.
coca leaves, refine it
Exactly.
into
Yeah.
cocaine,
Yeah.
and then that effect on the brain.
Yeah.
And then, so when a person believes that they have a food addiction, what does recovery mean?
Well, actually, there was another question that can you ask the question before that? It was, why do we care or something? I can't remember
Yeah,
exactly.
why do we care? Why is food addiction so important? Because it's not
Yeah.
acknowledged very much,
Okay.
unfortunately.
Yeah. Let me answer that first. So our body, it has been responded evolutionary wise to a food that I guess would be equivalent to like hunter and gathering, which is why the paleo and the keto diets are so popular out there. Those mimic the food plans that are more natural that we should be eating. So and part of that is it's what I can eat without wanting to overeat. So brain-wise, neurochemically, it's a better food plan. And also physiologically, hormonally, endocrine, like my pancreas and my liver can also metabolize normal food. But why do we care when it's addictive food? I'm overpowering the brain with hyperstimulus, and I'm also overpowering the demand for my liver and my pancreas to deal with all that extra sugar, all that extra insulin, all that extra fructose. I got to get rid of that, and it's making my body basically overtax itself, so that where I could get away easily with eating, one or two fruits a day and some I don't know, just real food like vegetables and carrots and that stuff, that's not overpowering my system. I'm able to tolerate that, and everything is fine. When I'm eating junk food, I essentially start to develop the same kinds of things that we see with alcoholism, but at a lower, slower scale, like first stage of cirrhosis, which we call fatty liver disease. And if I live long enough before I get diabetes and heart disease and then have a stroke and a heart attack, I could actually die of cirrhosis from all that sugar. It's just something else is likely to get me. So why do I care? These are the health conditions that we are struggling with in our society. The leading causes of death in sort of Western society, which is now pretty much world society, is heart attack, cancer, stroke. And then, of course, Alzheimer's and things like that. And those are all exacerbated, and some people will even say caused. I'm not going to go that far, but definitely exacerbated by processed food. I mean, we have a diabetic epidemic thanks to the excess of sugar. So that's why we care. The problem is we're not calling those the results of food addiction. We're calling them lifestyle diseases. Well, what's the lifestyle? It's the food we're eating. That's why we care. It's our healthcare system in crisis because of this mammoth amount of foods that our bodies can't handle and our brains can't handle.
So you had mentioned that two of the foods that are important to stop eating is
Yes.
sugar and flour. Does that mean that a person needs to stop consuming those forever, or just until?
Okay. So that leads into the concept of recovery. And one of the reasons why having that susceptibility scale is useful, or in the larger world, the DSM-5 addiction scale, is that it helps me define where a person is in terms of how far along they are in the addiction impairment syndrome, as it were. If they're early on, it may well be that just stopping sugar or cutting it down significantly is enough. But if they have been damaged to the point where I'm going to say they have an addiction, like, out of the criteria of 11 for the DSM-5, there's 11 criteria. If they're past 5, I'm going to say probably they're going to have to stop sugar forever, although we would never say forever. In the addiction world, we always say one day at a time, but we really mean forever. But it's possible earlier on, if you're under 3, that you might be able to moderate, but moderate only if we're talking about real food, because even a little bit of junk food is still more than what my body, it's still it's still the tobacco as opposed to the chewing leaves or something like that, like it's still too much. And when we talk about moderation, we somehow make this assumption that normal is what we're eating out there in the world. And I'd like to say, no, that's not normal. That's toxic. Just like cigarette smoking, not even one cigarette is normal. Yet, if everyone's smoking, we all think it's normal. Not even one candy bar is normal. It's too much. I would like to see people going back to eating like 1 or 2 pieces of fruit a day, like my grandparents did. You know.
That's so true.
Yeah.
And people even, they'll do different diets trying to say lose weight and improve their risk factors for heart attack and
Yes.
strokes and diabetes.
Yes. Well, let me just, can I address that? You know, the 2 popular diets right now, and I think they're popular because they stumbled onto a solution that they didn't know that they did, are the keto and the paleo, or some versions of those. I mean, keto means almost anything now, from just trying to focus on eating higher fat and higher protein and lower carbs, to the paleo, which is, you know, focusing on the proteins. Basically, it's a response to both of them. And the kind of new movement of today is to restrict carbs in some level. And I personally would say, well, I think that they're working for people because they're getting rid of the simple carbs, the processed food carbs. But I actually don't know if you have to be that low carb if you're actually eating vegetables. Like, there are people who do a plant-based diet that do very well, as long as they're not eating processed plant food stuff, like, you know, those stupid candy bars where they say it's still healthy because it's vegan or it's low carb. It's still processed, and therefore it's still not good. But if we just eat basically unprocessed stuff, we're pretty much on the way to recovery, because we're avoiding the overwhelming dollops of sugar or flour that end up being basically sugar to the brain and to the liver and to the pancreas.
It sounds like the bottom line is, if you find that you have a food addiction, the best way to cut it is to cut out the sugar and the flour. And then also in your wonderful book, Food Junkies, you also mentioned the importance of having the emotional support, because so much having any addiction in the first place is an emotional cause. Either it's some childhood issues we have, or a current issue triggering a past issue, or this current stress of having to,
absolutely,
hit his boss or whatever it may be.
Yeah, it's the same idea of it. Addiction in general, you know, what is the cause of addiction, or what is the solution to addiction? It's the opposite of addiction is connection. Whatever, you know, emotional, why do people pick up and use a substance that they probably know right on the get-go? Crack is pretty much, people know that's not a healthy thing to ever do. But why do they do it? Because they're responding to a very difficult situation. People know when they're eating bags of donuts that that's not healthy, but they're responding to an emotional need to numb their emotions or whatnot. So in the addiction paradigm, here's why I think it's such a useful paradigm. Aside from the fact that it's saying this is a substance that's triggering and will always make you want, we should talk about the neurochemistry a bit. That's only the first step to stop that. Now, like, you know, in the addiction world, we have a lot of times people will refer to using a 12-step program. It's only the first step. Then there's the 11 steps after that, which are all about how do I now live my life not having that substance. And if we don't use the step program and just use therapy, how do I live with all this emotional baggage now that I don't have my emotional bandage that I can no longer use? And that's where all that stuff comes into play. And if you don't do that stuff, you'll go back and pick up because that thing just helped you. Yeah.
I think a great way to do it is when you crave, for example, a substance that you know you're going to go down that endless rabbit hole, is to do your best to stop yourself and go, what emotion am I trying to comfort, soothe, avoid, run from, manage, and so on.
Yes. And you know, the first thing, or the 2 things to know is that when I like that term, the rabbit hole, or sometimes I think of it like quicksand or whatever it is, you're going down this thing. I mean, there's 2 things. One, you want to stop the thing that's causing that spiral down. And that often is a dopamine response, because when you're using the substance, you're getting an excess of dopamine, which is the euphoria or the bandage, the emotional comfort. And when you stop that, now you're in a deficit mode, and you're trying to respond to, I need that dopamine. And until you habituate back, you're going to be craving just for physiological reasons, none of this emotional stuff, just physiological. And if you cessate the food, stop it, then you're going to stop that process. It's like when you're trying to quit smoking, the first couple of days you just want the cigarette, but after a while you don't need it anymore. Then you have to deal with all the, like what we were talking about, the emotional stuff. So two things: stop the substance so that you don't have the drive to use just because of the physical. And then the second is, now I want to stay stopped. And this is where people have such a hard time. 3 months later, they're good, but they can't stay stopped. That's what we want to start looking at, what kind of therapy, emotional, DBT, CBT, mindfulness, all those things come into play to help me stay stopped. Because now I got to deal with my emotions.
Right.
Yeah.
In your wonderful book, it's called Food Junkies, and it's a book that I read, and it's about food addiction and recovery from food addiction. So we'll put on the screen and on the bottom of this some links. You have a Facebook group that I think is a wonderful wealth of support for anyone wanting to join it. You also have your book out, and you have a YouTube channel with numerous videos and podcasts that you've done, as well as your website that people can go to. So we'll put a link down below on that.
Thank you.
Now, is there anything else that you'd like to leave the audience with in terms of food addiction before we sign off?
Yeah, well, it was along the lines of the question that you sort of just ended with, which was the support and the need for support. Once the person has put down their substance and then they're dealing with their emotional stuff, we live in a world that is full of food cues that want us to go back to eating that stuff. And it's a very social world of eating food, parties, Christmas, Easter, whatever the holiday is, and it's always full of food. And it's really important to build a social buffer or a social network that supports this new way of living until it becomes the new for the whole of society. I mean, it used to be that you tried to quit, for example, quit smoking, and you were the oddball. But now the smokers are the ones that have to go outside and stand outside in the cold, and we get to stay inside. The new norm is to be a non-smoker. I think that will happen with this too, depending if we can. Well, maybe. I'm hoping it will. But in the meantime, I've got to have social supports that will normalize my desire to say, no, thank you. I don't eat that stuff. I'm allergic to it. I don't do well. I feel sick. I'm going to eat the whole thing whatever it is. And the social supports are really important. In the addiction world, we have this 12-step program. In the food world, it's a little less clear. And we need it so much more, though, because of this food world, this food philic. Everything it's so hard. So things like my Facebook group, like I'm Sweet Enough, Sugar Free for Life. There's a number of other ones out there too. Please join those and talk about your struggles and hear what tools people are using. But mainly it's going to be so that you don't feel like you're an oddball, because that's how it's going to feel. I still feel like an oddball, and I've been sugar-free for over 10 years. We're social beings and we're influenced. And I walk into a house of people that's eating sugar for the whole day, and by the end of the day, I'm almost having second thoughts. Not really, but almost. And so that kind of support is so, so, so important.
Feeling understood is huge.
Yes.
And having compassion for each other in the struggles that
absolutely.
Even though another person's addiction might be something else,
yes,
the point is it's a struggle. It's a personal struggle.
Yeah, and the food addiction and sugar addiction is often laughed at and is dismissed, but I would like to end with the idea that the awareness for people that I've had crack addicts, I've had hardcore alcoholics, I've had crystal meth addicts say that it's harder to quit sugar because it's in your face all the time. And that makes it so hard to quit. So if you're struggling, you're in the norm. And the first step is take it seriously and And I'd like to end with the concept of it actually doesn't take that long if you do the cessation, get the support, do all the tools. It actually only takes a few weeks before the insanity of wanting that stuff, the feeling of deprivation quiets. And now it's just, how do I stay this way? How do I stay sane? So the good news is you'll feel a lot better, much quicker than you expected if you follow this if you're ready to do this today.
Well, that sounds like a great plan. I think you're such a wealth of information, and I thank you so much for being here today. And I know folks out there will have a lot of information to think about, and I really appreciate your time and
Yes.
the book and the way that you write the book that makes it so understandable. It's very down to earth, as I mentioned to you before, in a way that I think people can relate. So thank you so much for being here today with us on your
Thank you. Thank you so much for asking me. As I said, I'm thrilled.
You're welcome.